remember what I was saying where the soul is like that still point? It's it's just present. It's just pure being. It's just love, really, with a capital L. And it doesn't struggle. It finds its total fulfillment in this very breath. Obviously, I've drunk the Kool-Aid on this about the non-ego and the healing aspect of it. um, and I've felt it for myself and I've seen it in in our patients, and it's really a gift to be able to distinguish oneself from that. Ego.
I do follow. Um, I've done it too. I um, just personally, I deal with anxiety, so it's a really great tool. It's a great way. I should say it's a great way to be, than rather than a tool, because in a tool will imply that I go back into. But it's an ongoing project, uh, at least for me. And when I do sessions, and you may not agree, Dr. Sandoval, but when I do sessions, I do uh, play with the ego with them. I do have them hang out with their ego. Um, Only because I feel like you can't objectify what you don't know. And I give them boundaries or like a made up map of saying, well, that's what we call the ego. And then there's this other thing out there. And we're not even gonna get there yet because that's still a lot to digest, to work on. Because someone comes into session and they're so angry at their mother or they're so angry at their father. And I'm just like, well, I mean, it's your ego. And then now they're mad at me because it's like I'm simplifying it, at least to them. And I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to get them to get to know that part, but then change the relationship with that part from that is not you, uh, because we think that that is the totality of me, and it's not. It's just um, it's building blocks that we acquire throughout our lives. And as you said, the ego is about 11 years old, so everything that happened through all that time, and then all these building blocks where you know, evident with the stuff behind me that I put behind me and for my background. It's just all ego. It's all, oh, this is me, but it really isn't. It's just stuff that I grew up liking, and it can all change tomorrow. Uh, but I I don't like to villainize the ego. I like to get to know it, and I do that in our sessions. I do get to know the ego and sort of reframe the relationship. Also, when a client's like, "I'm really angry at mom," I'm like, "Yeah, let's be angry." But but that also to me is ego play to be angry but I also don't feel that a lot of people that come to session are ready to say, "Oh, that's just my ego being angry." I think it's okay to feel that.
Absolutely. I really appreciate what you're bringing up, Jack, because in depending upon where a person's at, we may in therapy, there are theoretically two different approaches. I mean, obviously there are way more, but psychoanalytically speaking, we would talk about a supportive therapy, which is very much recognizing that the ego identity is not yet fully developed. And that can be due to trauma, where the ego um, actually fragments as a child, that when we're experiencing trauma. there's what what happens is there's like a almost a stuckness that can happen where we either stop developing, it's just like such a shock, and you just kind of freeze and paralyze, and it's sort of there's not an allowing to continue to develop, or there's a fragmentation and a split, and we can see this with dissociative states, where something so traumatic is happening, the child just like leaves the scene psychologically. So, which is a very helpful defense for them. But what can happen as young adults is that it hasn't fully formed. So there really isn't an ego identity that's stable and solid yet. And so therapy would be very respectful of that process, of continuing to allow it to sort of fill in and develop. And in that, when you're in that stage, the ego is my ego. It's my ego, and there's a identity with it, and that's okay, and that's important actually. So, and it doesn't mean that person isn't any better or worse than anyone. It's just where we're at. Okay.
Right.
So, but then if you're working with someone older, not necessarily older, but where they're having an experience where the ego personality is too limiting for them, they're realizing that this just isn't me. It's like that Talking Head song, this is not my beautiful wife. This is not my beautiful house. How did I get here? Like, wait, whose life am I leading? Like, and they're realizing there's really it begins to have a split in terms of it just doesn't even feel genuine anymore to sort of identify with the ego. And that can create a lot of internal conflict. And so then we go to a different approach, which is more acidic. It's more, we do talk, and we sort of let people know, hey, you may get really pissed off with me. It is okay. Like, we're going to talk, I'm going to make interpretations, or I might talk about the ego, and so usually they're on board because the way they've been working with themselves, there must be a better way. And when we're in that state where there's so much suffering and pain, and we're like, there must be a better way, that is the moment. That is the real opportunity of possibility of therapy, and where there can be true transformation. But sometimes it has to hurt so bad. I mean, this is why, Jung talks about the birthing pains of consciousness, where our suffering actually helps us. It guides us. It guides us into the direction of really dissociating, disidentifying. And then my ego stops being my ego. And it's just the ego, or that part of me, that autonomous part that hangs around, but we stop feeling like we have to defend it or protect it, or we don't find our identity in it as much anymore. And so that's when we start to really feel that freedom, that psychological freedom, and we get to be whatever we want. Like, there's so many more possibilities and ways of being when we're not so defending this one little piece of ourselves. So, and this is really too, you can tell when someone's on that path, when they're able to really laugh at themselves, not in a mean way, but just like, this is what Freud talks about, where humor is the most mature defense. Like, you begin to, you just begin to see it's sort of a ridiculousness of it, or it's silly, or, but not bad or mean, but just like, it's funny. It's funny what the ego tries for.
I do have to agree that clients of a certain age are they're more receptive to this objectifying the ego, of not identifying with the ego, of opening up to something new. Because I also feel naturally, it happens naturally, which is probably a really awful example, but the difference between a 20-year-old who at 10 p.m. is just getting the party started and a 40-year-old's like, I might do brunch. I might, you know, we naturally start to fall into the things that we want or how we want to behave on this planet. But it's not what I'm getting at is I lost my train of thought.
That's the post 40 comment.
It's, I gotta tell you, ever since COVID, I had COVID like 2 months ago. Some people are just like they'll say something to me, and I'm just like, I don't know what just happened. Not in sessions though.
Yeah, we get to have that fun with menopause too. I'm just warning you. That's coming. No one warned me enough. But yeah.
Well, like I was saying about the person that's a bit middle aged, they're more receptive, and I feel that when I have younger clients, uh, and I try to talk about this, their ego really is like, oh no, we're gonna fight now. Like, no, you're not gonna destroy me, you know.
And they're right, Jack. They're right. They're right because I really feel like this is very tricky territory that we're talking about. Um, and this is in a way we're navigating it and we're all learning too. But kind of like if there's a resistance, so you make an interpretation and there's a resistance. I think it's so important to honor that, to honor the resistance. And because it's almost like you can't, it really is, there's usually not a shortcut. It really is an unfolding that needs to happen. And again, many of us have really nice lives, ego lives. Okay. And the way the ego thinks about life is it's constantly looking out in the world and trying to organize the world so that it feels good. And many people have that luxury, like they're able to organize their lives in such a way so that they feel okay. Okay. We're in the top 1%. We're very privileged here in the United States, many of us. And we have the ability to, many of us do have the ability to organize our lives in such a way where we're fairly unperturbed. The ego can kind of sort of skate. Okay. Usually though, when someone is motivated to come to therapy, there's a breakdown in that arrangement. And this is where that's great. Okay, this is why we say, breakdowns, great. Trigger, great. Like, even though the ego doesn't like it, but the soul, the non-ego, there's like a crack, kind of, the sun can come in, like the breakdown, something can shift. And then when there's an openness, that's when we can start talking about this kind of thing. But I really don't think it's helpful because you're right. The ego is just going to dig in. If it's feeling threatened, if it's feeling questioned, if it's feeling criticized, that's what it does. And if I'm identified with that, then you're not just threatening my ego. It doesn't make that distinction. You're threatening me.
Yeah.
And we don't, as therapists, really, we do no harm. We're not going to challenge that in any way. In fact, what we want to do is really create a safe space for that exploration. And, it's really, this is the art, right, of this is the dance that we do, is, you know, tending to and meeting a person exactly where they're at. You know, there's just such an eachness in the session. Because a person may be in a completely different place one week to the next as well. So yeah, we really listen for it. And though you're always listening with one ear to the soul, right? You're always got it. It's always there. And then when they start to speak, you're like, oh, right, oh, you know, and you can respond. But you're right. I think that the conversations about the ego, or trying to do psychoeducation about the ego, timing is so important. And you know, we'll learn, and they'll teach you.
Yeah.
Our patients will educate us where they're at, you know.
Yeah.
Like, you may try an interpretation, you're like, okay, got it, I got it, it's fine, you know. And they'll help us know where they're at.
Yeah, I also find ego to push back when I'm heavy-handed with the soul, with with the self, capital S self, um, with listening to that voice that's peeking through, because, and this is something I have to work on as a therapist. But when people come into my session, I have a tendency to believe, oh, the soul is here and wants to be heard, but they just don't know it. And then I, vomit all this stuff on them, and they're like, "Oh my God, this guy's nuts." And I've had people butt up, the ego, I should say, push back. And as you said, and I learned this the hard way, I allowed for the person on the other side, for ego, to play in the playground, to play in the sandbox. And for me to be like I am with my children, to just sit back on the bench and just watch and just observe. And it's hard because as a psychologist, when the session's over, you feel like you've done nothing. And you're just like, why are you just go back to flipping burgers? You were better at that. And it's very hard to sit there, capital F father, and allowing for all this to go, because you're there, you want to help. You want to give them the keys, break the code. And I have the answer. It's the soul. And um, but that ego really fights back. So anyone out there, if you're 40 and over, I'm the best for 40 and over clients. 20s and 30s, go to Dr. Sandoval.
What do you, Dr. Schwab?
Or Dr. Schwab.
No, I really appreciate what you're saying, Jack. I love it. And I think too, what that I'm gonna just say that my reflection to you is that if you're noticing kind of a tension, it's your ego, because it can only be two egos in tension. Remember what I was saying, where the soul is like that still point? It's it's just present. It's just pure being. It's just love, really, with a capital L. And it doesn't struggle. It finds its total fulfillment in this very breath. It doesn't need to be entertained. It doesn't need to fix anything. It doesn't need to do anything. It just can, right? So that when we really can find that within ourselves, and it is hard to be a psychologist because we have these demands on us, like you have this, like a way of life. It isn't like you're just a psychologist in the session and then it's over. Phew, blah blah blah. I can go do my ego. I mean, this is like, I'm sure you've noticed, this is like always with us. And so but I really do feel like it takes a long time. And you know, but it's inevitable.